Wow, it's like looking into a different little world. Let's see.
Wait, somebody must not be coming or something. Is that why you're recording? Yeah.
Matt is in quarantine.
Okay.
Um,
That guy was like 23.
Have you actually known a significant number of students that have had COVID on campus or have been in quarantine?
Too many.
You said there is a significant number? Or
No, I was just asking.
There's been a decent amount quarantined.
I know the whole, like, I think it's
The
like.
men's soccer team had it rough at the beginning.
Wow.
Yeah, no, I said what happens, what makes our numbers go up is the athletic teams because like one girl on lacrosse got it, so now the whole lacrosse team's in quarantine.
My goodness.
Yeah, they all
What does
have
that do
to
to
go
the
down.
season?
That's the point. That's why they're pushing for athletes to get vaccinated so it doesn't like deteriorate our season.
Right.
Take one and pass the others around.
Even if it
Did
doesn't.
we finish
The
Friday's
quarantine
lecture?
should be going from
Yes,
like 2
but we
to
didn't finish Monday's
35 and
lecture.
1.
Wait, what
Oh,
day?
because I finished Friday's lecture on Monday.
Oh.
So you must not have watched the lecture
I have
yet.
not gotten
All
to
right.
it.
I wasn't soliciting a confession. These are the notes from Monday's class. I typically, again, it's my practice to print out the notes so that and pass them out in class so that you have a physical something to take notes on. But I also send them out. And here are the notes for today.
Yay.
What does eliminate liberty mean?
Where are you looking?
Eliminate liberty.
Oh, okay. I was like,
I do invent words, but that was not an invented word. That was probably my illegible handwriting. Immolate. It does say immolate. So what would immolate mean? Doesn't it sound like something you do with a blender? I think
It
that's
does.
By the way, it wasn't a regular blender, not that stupid. It was an immersion blender. I was cleaning it out and I forgot to unplug it. And then I turned it on and my finger was inside it.
What's wrong with your car? What happened?
Oh, it was the water pump.
What kind of car do you drive?
2005 Honda Elevate. It's the best car I've ever had. I love that car. I just want to hug it, except I don't want to hurt the finish. All right, let me see who's here.
More papers.
Pardon me?
More papers. In case you needed them.
Well, I hate trees, so I want to make sure there's many dead trees. Let's see, I'm still practicing your name. Sophia. Sienna. TJ.
He's here.
Amanda. Actually, since you weren't in my original set of visual memories, I'm going to have to work hard to remember your face. And because of the mask doesn't help either. Everyone looks like Uncle Robert. Matt, not here. Haley. Right? I think you can go home now. I've had my significant achievement for the day. Yeah, that's probably Samira, Sammy, and Lexi, and Tiffany. I'm just on a roll. It's good. It's good to be in the middle of your old age decline and have a good moment.
You funny.
Yeah. Sabrina and Sydney.
Where's everyone going? Working?
There are only 2 people missing here.
Oh.
Look.
I'm sorry, my Hamilton class is like full, so I always forget.
So
She's not on quarantine, bro. I just seen her
What?
yesterday.
They must be
She's
till
not.
like
She's here
1776.
Huh?
She's
I
not.
like
She's here
it.
somewhere.
It's easier to understand than Hamilton.
Not
It's
listening.
funnier.
I was just thinking out loud.
I think that the traditional musical probably is not necessarily anchored in young people's taste today.
Well, I like it.
I mean, do you guys enjoy like?
And it's helping me
Well, by the
with
way,
class.
since you haven't seen any live theater for 2 years because of the pandemic, do you guys like live theater?
No.
It depends.
I saw a Broadway production one time. It's pretty cool.
What was it?
The Life of Gloria Estefan.
Wow.
It was a really random one that
And actually, Broadway plays are pretty expensive today. When I went to see Hamilton, my friends in Philadelphia, because I could never afford it, the tickets were $1,500 a piece.
Oh.
You know Maddie in our Hamilton class, the redhead?
Yes, yeah.
She just saw Hamilton.
Wow.
Literally like 2 days ago.
We'll have to have her testify
She's cheating.
She's already watched the movie.
How many of you seen Hamilton?
0.
I think it's a great piece of art, but you have to unpack it, and I hope to
I see
appreciate.
TikToks about Hamilton all the time.
You mean the musical
Mm-hmm.
or the person?
Oh, the musical.
Well, he's worth it. He's a complex and interesting person. One of the most, by the way, like Washington and a couple of other, say a handful of 10 people, whose presence at the founding probably would either not have produced our country or produced a very different country. So we'll investigate. So, do you have the chartograph? Now,
It got cut off at the bottom.
did it?
Yeah.
Boy, that is tragic. Oh, and besides, I want to
I think you should go make some more copies real quick.
That'd be even more for the trees. I do want to, how many of you had biology?
Nope. I'm in physics. Because I'm an idiot.
So, what's a genus and a species?
Is this, I did that my first semester, that was like 2 years ago.
I don't know, that's a term of biological
It does.
classification.
Oh.
Is
that-
that like a subgroup of like?
Yeah, and you're going to see why I'm raising the subject. But sometimes when you use a term like chartograph, you're not sure if your audience has had it. So, but I would have thought that genus and species would have passed into the general language. So, it's okay. So, what's a genus and species?
A genus and species.
Yes, do you know the genus is what and what's a species? Actually, technically, have you ever seen like the tree of biological classification starting with kingdom? You know, like plant, animal, and people in New Jersey. Just kidding. Plant, animal, and actually I think, aren't fungi in their own kingdom or something?
Yeah, they are actually.
Who knows what those mushrooms are doing? Just let them alone and they just have a good time. And then it's like kingdom, phylum, family, class.
Yeah.
Order, genus, species, everything.
Well, genus and species are technically the last two orders of biological classification. And what you said, Sophia, is basically the case. A genus, actually genus is the Latin word for class, like a class of things. And species literally means, like our word specific comes from it. So what a genus and species is, it's arranging things into a general class, but then you differentiate the specific things within each class. So for instance, anybody know what the biological genus of human beings is?
Homo.
Homo. And what's our specific species designation?
Sapiens.
Now, I have to say, once you go to a faculty meeting, you wonder if our species actually deserves that designation. Because you know what sapiens means? Homo sapiens? What's sapiens, you know? It's the Latin word for wise. So literally, our species name, I guess you could say, you could name our own species. Like, I guess, if another species, you know what you mean, like Homo uglius, or Homo traffic jamus, or something like that. But there are other species, like Homo Neanderthalis, Homo
Is it Homo erectus one?
Homo erectus. There are about 4 or 5 species of Homo, and they've all gone extinct, except for us, and we're working on it.
That's
So
true.
anyway, the reason I went through all of this is, I think it helps to see what Madison is trying to do in this essay by looking at the genus. In fact, I'll saunter over to this board. All right, camera, follow me. So here's the genus.
Oh, you have to go right behind this.
I know, it's good exercise though. You can't even read it anymore.
Not more
right?
Say you be on him, bro. Give him a break, bro.
What's that?
She always trying to tell you something, bro.
Alright,
On
it's
the
'cause I'm a
bright
smart
side,
ass.
Sammy. Take off a pleasant outlook, put on a happy face. How many times does your professor sing to you? I know, that's why
Well,
she.
you
You were the first one to bark
I
at
know,
me
and
too.
we
No,
should-
yeah, how many times
You
We
were
should
the
give out
first
your
one to-
sickness bags.
You were the first one to bark at me and sing to us, so.
Hey, if one of us can bark better than you,
Oh.
we should not have a test.
Well, we were walking home from services last week, Rosh Hashanah.
You told
okay.
us your friend thought a dog.
Yeah,
Sienna's on her way to class.
He thought I was the dog.
He's
And I think you're
I was
going to leave an
concerned.
important legacy behind. All right. It will help to understand Madison's argument if there's nothing left in here. These things last 5 minutes. Why don't I just chew off my finger and write in blood?
You have one in your office?
I'll go check. Don't move.
You know, I got some in my room. I can run back to
Should
it.
all just switch seats at
Bro,
this
do we
point?
have to come here for the test?
Yeah, I think so.
I got it. All I know is
Somebody should ask that. Let me ask that. Remind me. Don't let me forget.
Bro. I wanted to stay up here and ask him a question about the PRQ.
Oh shit, I can't.
Has anyone started the PRQs?
I'm through number 12.
I've done most of them, but I don't know the answers to all of them. But I've done like a handful of them.
Bro,
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, did you see my email? I postponed the exam from Friday till Monday.
That's
Yes.
my question.
I didn't think there would be serious objections.
No.
And the reason was we kind of lost a day, and we'll finish up, we'll start the section on slavery and race, and that'll carry over to Friday, but then I'll also leave some time to when I ask questions. I think this board is dead too.
You know, you'd kill a lot less trees if you printed our stuff right back.
I know, but what's a tree ever done for you?
Giving us oxygen.
I can give you oxygen.
No, you can't.
Oh,
You spit out
wait,
carbon
I have a
dioxide
question
next
right
to
fast.
the
Yeah.
Are we coming here for the test?
Yes.
I have another question.
Well, you'll make them to your house?
Hello.
No, I didn't know because.
All of a sudden you're there.
I have a question about the test as well. You said you're giving us 15 of the PRQs
And you choose to
10.
10, yeah.
But chapter 2 is only 15 PRQs. Are you giving us the questions that are after the PRQs as well?
No, on all the readings.
What do you mean on all the readings?
Have you seen the sheet of PRQs that I sent out for the first exam?
Yes.
Those are what's on the exam. Those have to do with all the readings.
So like all the pages? Oh my word. Okay.
So the genus is the class of things is what I would call popular government. Then the species of popular government has two species. What are the two species of popular government that Madison talks about in Federalist 10?
Oh.
Oh, by the way, and literally two kinds of, so what's popular government? Popular government, to use Lincoln's phrase at the end of the Gettysburg Address, is government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's government who derives its authority from the consent of the people and which operates essentially by popular will. That is to say, in one way or the other, the government tries to shape its policies according to the will of the people. Now, by the way, not every form of government is a democracy, or I just told you the answer. So what are the two species?
Yeah.
What are the two species of popular government? Democracy and republic. And it also helps that a mnemonic, that democracy begins with what letter? D. And republic begins with what letter?
R.
Aren't you glad you're in college? So democracy is popular government by direct participation, where the people rule directly in person. And there have been governments like that. Athens, which was, I might have mentioned this, Athens, the Greek city-states were about the size of one of our counties. And so Athens was about as large as Spartanburg County, and the actual city of Athens was about as large as Spartanburg City. Athens had about 500,000 inhabitants, about half were slaves, and of the free inhabitants, about 126,000 were males, and they served in the assembly. The Greeks both invented tragedy, comedy, and the popular assembly. And the same amphitheater where they would go to watch tragedies, like it could seat 30,000 people at a time, and literally they would cycle through the adult population of males to govern the city. So literally Athens was governed directly by the population, as were some of the smaller towns in New England. So republic, on the other hand, the people rule indirectly through what mechanism? Beginning with the same letter. Representation. So if it helps, so Madison's argument is the genus of popular government has two species: democracy, where the people rule directly. And by the way, here in this article, I could have finished writing the word, but I write illegibly anyway. That says democracy. Why don't I just write like that? Yes, yeah.
Where are the papers for today?
Oh. Ask and thou shalt be granted. I will send them directly by way of the people on this side of the class, if you are willing to help out. So here's the charcoal graph. We ran out of those. Well, I have it up there anyway. So, and here is, oh, here's the next one. And if you want, I'll autograph it. Dear Sienna, be sharp. Don't be flat. Be natural.
You lie. That's not even your quote.
No, my high school music teacher would sign our yearbooks with that.
I know. You told us in.
I know. Be sharp. Don't be flat. Be natural. You can give it an autographed one. It'll be worth money in 50 years. And here's the notes from Monday, and here's the notes for today. So popular government can have two species. Now, as you're going to see, to understand Federalist 10, what the framers of the Constitution did is, strictly speaking, invent a new subspecies of republican government. Here's what I mean by that. So if this is the species of popular government, and it's democracy and republic, here's what was the point of making my lecture yesterday. All republics that existed previously in human history, the Venetian Republic, even the states after the Revolution, they had all been small republics because the experience of human history and political theory had suggested if you're going to have a government in which the will of the people really does, in some ways, direct the policy of the government, the collective wisdom of humanity was that that had to be a small form of government, where the people knew each other, they could actually speak to each other and participate. And so what the framers of the Constitution did was, strictly speaking, invent a new kind of republic. So you have to say that prior to the Constitution, all republics were small, but then a large or extended republic is what the Constitution produces. So as you're going to see when we walk through Madison's argument, strictly speaking, what Madison is doing in Federalist 10 is he's not only making an argument that republics are better than democracy for reasons we'll see in a minute, and by the way, the reason that republics are better than democracies are, what's the big problem he starts this essay out with? What's the issue that Federalist 10 begins by defining?
The problem is I cannot read your handwriting.
That's helpful, isn't it? You know, maybe I should hire a professional translator.
I love how you spelled eliminate wrong twice.
Jason.
Well, I did use fewer letters, so fewer trees died. It says faction.
Oh, okay.
Now, have you guys watched my lecture from me? I confess to putting it a little, like Monday was a little...
The majority tyranny?
Tyranny.
Tyranny? Sorry.
Yes. So the problem that Madison is starting out in addressing is the problem of faction in human life. Now, as I said in my lecture, let's be clear. The tendency, Madison says, the tendency of people to fall into contending and bitter factions in any group, no matter if it's politics or whatever, is embedded in our natures. And so, literally, Madison is suggesting there will never be a society which don't have factional differences. What many societies do, like dictatorships and totalitarian societies, is they suppress the factions. How many of you know what Yugoslavia was? What was Yugoslavia at the time?
It was a country in Europe, but it was really small and it was run of. It wasn't like super small, but like compared to like landslides like.
When was Yugoslavia created?
Ooh, I don't know.
Does anybody know? After World War I, there was a whole spate of new countries created by the Allied victors in World War I, where they tried to unite different ethnicities, and like Yugoslavia was a new country. Iraq, by the way, was created in the light of World War I. And so the idea was you could bring all these ethnicities together into a state, and by putting them in a common state, they would learn to get along with each other. Well, what happened in Europe very quickly after World War II, if you remember, is the Soviet Union extended the sway of communism and Stalinist rule right up until the middle of Europe, which is where the Iron Curtain was, and Yugoslavia fell into that. And then he installed a dictator, Tito, Marshal Tito, who then ruled Yugoslavia with an iron hand. Now, certainly you know who ruled Iraq up until the point where we overthrew his government. Who was the ruler of Iraq before we overthrew his government, and then, remember, we captured him and he was hanged.
Ooh.
Guys, it just happened 20 years ago.
Saddam
Hussein.
Hussein. Now, by the way, I'm making the point between Iraq and Yugoslavia in this sense. It turns out that Iraq was also replete with all kinds of Islamic factions and different ethnic factions. And Saddam Hussein was a real terror, by the way. He used chemical weapons against his own people, and he suppressed those differences, just like Tito did. Once Tito was overthrown, however, in the 1980s and communism ended, and once Saddam Hussein was overthrown, what happened to those societies?
They crumbled.
Well, did you ever hear of ethnic cleansing?
Oh, genocides.
After Yugoslavia fell apart because of the fall of communism in 1989 and 90, then all of those ethnic factions, like the Serbs, the Croatians, the Kosovars, all those little ethnicities suddenly started to tear each other apart and do terrible things to each other in the struggle to be independent of each other. People that had been neighbors for thousands of years were suddenly raping and murdering each other. And the same in Iraq. Once you withdrew, and by the way, both Tito and Hussein were terrible. But in some ways, what did they suppress? They suppressed the reality of the factional differences in their society. And so Madison's point is faction and the problem of faction. It's more obvious in free governments or in popular governments. Why? Why do you think? In fact, he has a great line. He says, faction, liberty is to faction as oxygen is to fire. If you have a society that has different groups in it, ethnic groups, different religious groups, different economic groups, and every society does, if you let those people freely associate and express themselves and talk and move about freely, what's going to happen to the differences among them? Think about this. This is a real problem that you're going to see with popular government democracy. The more free a government is, the more open it is, the more liberty is, actually, the more factions come out and express themselves. Do you see why? If people are free to talk and free to associate with each other, they'll form groups, won't they? But if you're living in the Soviet Union, where if you congregated on a street corner with 3 other people, you'd be arrested, then do you understand what happens to factional differences? They may be there, but people just can't act on them or express them. They're hidden. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I don't understand like how factions are a problem. Like if we have like a free, like if you are living in like a free government, like and there's factions appear, like that's okay as long as we're all able to do our own thing.
Well, do people always get along with each other? I mean, do you think there are factional differences in our country today?
Yeah.
Yes.
Terrible ones, would you say?
Yeah.
In fact, our two-party system, which for the most part has had a tendency to kind of moderate differences between people in the last 10 years, if anything, it's become more fractious. And so, and by the way, I think I see where you're going, Sophia. Isn't it good to have like lots of different groups of people in society?
Yeah.
Diversity, right? And you're going to see, by the way, Madison thinks so too. Because can factional differences in a society lead to murder and tyranny? Sure. Can democracies be tyrannical? Here's a grim fact about American history. From the end of the Civil War until the beginning of World War I, there were about 5,000 lynchings in the South. Black men, women, and children murdered. And who murdered them, by the way? The white majority. So, as you're going to see, what I said in my lecture, what the framers discovered during this period was, at the beginning of the revolution, they thought tyranny only could come from a bad king, right? All this concentration of power. But with all the failures of government in the Articles of Confederation, they saw that actually tyranny wasn't just a function of monarchy, that even the legislature and the judiciary could be tyrannical too. But the most sober lesson was not only could institutions become tyrannical, but people themselves, democracies, can become tyrannical. Now, to understand the argument in Federalist 10, why is that? Why is it that a democracy which is direct rule by the people, why does it go wrong? Why can it be destructive and tyrannical? Where's the problem, in other words?
If like one faction it gets too much bigger than the other faction.
Yes, in fact, the example I'm going to use of Madison's argument, which I think is the clearest example, is religious faction. But let me finish his argument and we'll come back to it. But you got the right point, Sidney. If a faction in society becomes so powerful and such a large majority that no other faction in society can withstand it, then just like anybody else that has power, what will that majority try to use its power to do?
Push their agenda?
Yeah, suppress, deny, and manipulate the majority. And by the way, it's the point of my lecture yesterday was both Federalist 10 and 51 trace the problem of tyranny and faction back to human nature itself. In both these essays, Madison takes the problem. It's not a bad society. People don't become factious because you're living in New Jersey or anything like that, although that's probably bad enough. But it turns out the causes of faction, which is why Madison says in Federalist 10, you can't eliminate them. You can't eliminate them because where do the causes lie? In human nature. So what would you have to do to create a society that got rid of all factions between people?
You'd have to create a society where human nature was no longer right.
That's right, you have to literally change human nature. And by the way, if you remember the Diamond article, The Revolution of Sober Expectations, his argument is the reason the French and the Russian revolutions became so bloody and murderous was because they set their goals for society and human beings so high, so utopian, that they literally tried to change human nature. But how many of you had parents? Now, my guess is your parents tried to make you into better people than you otherwise would have. Like they took your cell phone away from time to time, right?
Yeah.
They made you turn off your video games. They made you stop throwing things at the neighbor kids, right?
Oh, I just throw stuff in my litter.
But did your parents do that to make you better people?
Presently, yeah.
Well, let's hope it worked. But I have to say, when I was in high school, our basketball coach had 5 sons, and he was such a fanatical basketball coach, he drove them all into basketball. And the youngest son, who really didn't want to be a basketball player, eventually couldn't stand the strain and committed suicide. My point here is, if you push people and human nature against their essence, eventually you're either going to destroy human beings or they're going to turn against you or something like a wild animal. And so in some ways, Madison's point is, societies that try to perfect human beings will probably be doomed to some kind of tyranny and oppression. So as you're going to see, what Federalist 10 tries to do with the problem of faction is not try to eliminate the causes. So if you're looking at my chartogram,
Graph.
after defining the problem of faction, and so as I say in the PRQs, you should memorize this definition. At the beginning of the essay, it says a faction is a group of citizens consisting of either a majority or a minority moved by a common interest or impulse of passion, opinion, or interest, adverse to the rights of others in the community or to the common good. So I know that's a long definition, but it's right at the beginning. So look at each component in that definition. So a faction is a group of people, right? And it can be either what? The number can either be what or what?
Majority or minority?
A majority or a minority. And you're going to see that becomes critical to his controlling the effects later on in the argument, and why he thinks a republic is better than a democracy. I'll just tell you the answer. Because in a democracy where the people rule directly, there is no control on the power of the majority. And just like an absolute dictator becomes all powerful, in a direct democracy, once a majority forms and takes over the society, because you understand, if it's a democracy, there is no other force other than the majority. Does that make sense? So once it comes into power, oftentimes democratic majorities have been just as brutal as individual tyrants. And why? Because there is no power to restrain them. So, and look at the rest of the definition. They are moved by a common impulse of, and the 3 critical terms here that he uses are opinion, passion, and interest. So when you look at the differences between people in your society, our society, or in your life, what makes people want to slam their door in the face of each other? And Madison, I think, is right about this. You can be moved by let me ask you, do people hate each other because of their opinions about things?
Yes.
Not only political opinions, but I don't know what. The people who like the Cubs. By the way, I want to come back to that.
That's not even, people who like the Patriots, you should say.
All right, good. See, that's how much, I don't know football. They all look like overweight ballerinas to me.
People who like Tom Brady.
Well, don't they? I mean, they wear tights. There's something wrong with that game.
I have a
You
question.
get all those guys with tights, and then they're playing, oh, yeah.
Where is the definition that you just gave
At the
us?
beginning of Federalist 10.
Oh, just at the, okay, it's not in the notes.
No, I refer to
Notes
it.
or a summary.
So, but I want to go through make sure you got each component of the definition. It's a group of citizens amounting to either a majority or minority, moved by a common impulse of passion, interest, or opinion. What about interest? Have you ever heard of the AMA or the ABA? What's the ABA? Ever heard that?
I've heard it, but I don't
becoming
remember what
lawyers?
it stands for.
It's the American Bar Association.
Okay, okay. It's like, I swear I've heard that before.
It's the professional organization of lawyers. What's the AMA?
The medical board?
Yeah, the American Medical Association. Now let me give you an example, because we tend to think that doctors and lawyers are like special kinds of people, like all the television series, like
Grey's Anatomy.
Grey's Anatomy, and they're
Speaking
always like
of,
hopping
did
into
she
each
say
other's
something
bed, and then
about-
they go and operate and
Yeah.
save people and like a soap opera. Okay, so here is an issue that doctors and lawyers, it turns out, are at each other's throats over: medical malpractice insurance. What is medical malpractice insurance?
Basically a doctor not doing what they're supposed to do.
Well, that's malpractice. And by the way, doctors are actually human beings. And they make mistakes, but sometimes they make terrible mistakes. There was a woman in Florida about 10 years ago who the surgeons left like a forceps and like 3 or 4 instruments. Oh, and a guy in Florida about 20 years ago had gangrene in his right leg and they amputated the wrong leg.
Oh, that's the one I was about to say.
So do doctors make mistakes?
Yes.
So when can you sue a doctor for his mistakes?
When that mistake is so big that it affects your livelihood?
Say that again, sir.
When that mistake is so big that it affects your livelihood?
Right, I mean, you could say this, doctors have professional standards, and when they live up to them, they can still make mistakes. Like it turns out we don't know everything about the human body yet. But sometimes doctors make mistakes because they're terrible doctors, and they cause terrible harm on people. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, what's medical malpractice insurance?
It's insurance that covers, like, pretty much covers the doctors behind in the fact that they don't have to pay it out of pocket.
If they get sued.
Or if they get sued.
Yeah, and by the way, for your information, there are 2 kinds of damages you can sue for. One is called compensatory damages, and the other one is called punitive damages. I'll give you a quick example. You remember there was a car, which you're all too young to remember, called the Ford Pinto. It was a little runabout in the 70s, and it was economical, but it turns out one of the reasons it's economical is they put the gas tank right in back of the passenger compartment and kept it in place with a little cardboard strap. And in California in 75, I think, a mother and her son were riding in a Pinto, and they were rear-ended, and it turns out when you rear-ended a Pinto, the gas tank went right into the passenger compartment.
Oh.
And she was burned to death, and he was had 98% of like 3rd-degree burns all over his body. He was, and by the way, his lawyers sued Ford for both compensatory damages and punitive damages. So what do you think compensatory damages are? If somebody injures you and you lose work, or you have to pay for medical costs, those are called compensatory damages. Because what are you suing them for? So that you get compensated, literally, for your damages. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, compensatory damages are usually limited by the nature of the thing. Like that boy had like $3 million in medical expenses and everything like that. So he was awarded. But his lawyers also sued for an additional $12 million. In the 1970s, that was a lot of money. Why? Not to just compensate the boy, but to punish Ford. For what?
Killing his mom and being ignorant.
For not like thinking through the problems of like.
For designing such a poorly designed automobile that it was a danger to drive. And so, by the way, the jury awarded him both compensatory and punitive damages. Now, the reason I mention that definition is when doctors make terrible mistakes, the patient almost always wins compensatory damages. But if their lawyers can prove that there was negligence or unprofessionalism, then it can up the amount. See, in most of our jury systems in the United States, there aren't limits on punitive damages. It's what the jury feels. So, do you understand why doctors don't like that?
Yes.
So many doctors and many, the AMA actually got together and persuaded state legislatures in many places to pass limits on the amount of damages that people can win in malpractice suits. Now, how many of you think that's a good idea? Who loves that idea? To put limits on what patients can sue for malpractice.
I think it's smart, but I wouldn't say I love it.
Well, who do you think loves it?
Doctors?
Doctors love it. Why? Because the threat of being sued for malpractice is so financially destructive that they take out insurance just against that very thing. And so if there's no limit to malpractice damages, what happens to the insurance costs of most medical practices?
Goes super high. It's
Yeah, they go super high, and that's one of the reasons fueling the cost of medicine in the United States. Now, guess who loves the idea of medical malpractice suits?
Patients.
Yes. Yes. Why? Why do lawyers love it?
Because they get paid.
That's right. In our system of the legal damages, lawyers get a percentage of the reward. It's not like the British system where they get independently paid no matter what the award is. So do you understand? Lawyers have a self-interest to get their clients to sue for more. My point here was, we think of lawyers and doctors as like saints, right? But when push comes to shove, don't they have their own self-interest like anyone else?
Mm-hmm.
And you can talk about how high-minded doctors and lawyers are. When it comes to money, what are doctors and lawyers going to insist on? What's good for them? So do you understand when Madison says that a faction can be formed of self-interest, doesn't self-interest pit people against each other all the time?
Yes.
What about passion? I think there was a presidential election last year in this country, right? I think the president was named Donald Trump. Now, I'm almost afraid to mention that class because the moment do you ever see The Lion King?
Yeah.
Yes.
You remember how the hyenas teased each other? They would say, Mufasa, and they go, right? There were people, if you just mentioned Trump's name, they hated him so much that literally they would not hesitate to express it. I saw families that were torn apart. I saw friends that ceased to be friends. And I have to say, I think some people feel the same way about Biden. Isn't it just true that some people have a passionate attachment to certain leaders and other people hate them?
Mm-hmm.
So can people be torn about by opinion?
Yeah.
Or passion, I mean. And by the way, Madison actually says here, oftentimes charismatic leaders arise in society that have just this effect on people. It's not as if they represent an opinion or something. People are just, what would we call that? What's that? Oh, charisma. Don't you agree that there are people who are so charismatic that people just lose their minds?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of, you're too young to remember the Beatles. The reason I say that is when in 1964, when the Beatles came to this country, all of a sudden you saw thousands and thousands of young girls just screaming and fainting because of these 4 British singers.
Are you talking about One Direction?
No, the Beatles.
The Beatles.
I was
Well,
like,
you've heard of Elvis Presley, haven't you?
yeah.
All right, so it's the same thing. Young women would faint at Elvis Presley. So, if Elvis Presley and the Beatles could do that, you know, you have such things as charismatic leaders. Do people disagree on things like climate change?
Yeah.
Do they disagree violently?
Understand.
Yeah.
So my point here is do you see Madison's observation that human society, and so you see that people can come to different factions because of what they believe, their feelings, and their interests. Now that's true everywhere, but why is it especially true in free societies? If people can't talk to each other because they'll be killed or put in prison, that has a tendency to suppress differences in society, doesn't it? So it's the fact that we do have freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and a free economy that people can actually associate with each other, and moreover, as you're going to see, with popular government, it's not just that an opinion or passion and interest forms among the people. In popular government, the policy of the government tries to imitate the people. So if you can have an effect on government, what will most people try to do? They'll try to use the government for their own good, right? And so what Madison is saying here, let's finish the definition. A group of people, majority or minority, moved by a common impulse of faction, of an interest, opinion, or passion. Adverse, what's adverse mean? Yeah, opposed to. Listen to the last part. The common good of the community or the rights of other people. When doctors are arguing against malpractice, unlimited malpractice suits, do you think they care about the lawyers? When farmers who, American farming today is primarily subsidized by the government, not a part plan. Did you know that? Do you have any of your families are farmers? Federal subsidies from the Depression to stabilize prices. So it turns out the government regularly pays billions, if not trillions, of dollars for farmers to support the agriculture. Now, by the way, do farmers like that?
Yeah.
Are there bad aspects of this policy? Yes. Did you know, for instance, that tobacco farmers are regularly subsidized by the U.S. government at the same time that the U.S. government has all but criminalized cigarettes? So my point here is, if something's in your interest, do you really care what's good for other people or good for the country?
No.
Now, in some cases, people may be moved by patriotism, but as I said in my lecture, the energy that the framers are turning to, both in Federalist 51 and 10 here, is what they consider to be the most durable and stable source of human motivation, which was self-interest. So can you eliminate self-interest in human life?
No.
So all you can do is try to control the effects. And if you remember in Federalist 51, with the separation of powers and checks and balances, what Madison is talking about there is what the Constitution does, is create a kind of a tension of interest between the different branches of government. And that's what restrains the governments. But what fuels it? Self-interest. So what turns out to limit the problem of self-interest in institutions? By embracing self-interest. You use self-interest to control the energy of self-interest. It's like if your parents try to get you to stop fighting, they could beat you, right? Or lock you in your rooms. Could they give you an allowance? Now, is that appealing to your higher nature to stop arguing with your siblings if they give you money?
Yeah.
Your higher nature? Here's an argument.
No,
for you.
wait, not higher.
If you're
Yeah,
arguing
sorry,
with your brother and
I'm
sister, and I was your parent, I'd say, Shia, stop shooting bees at your sister. It's just not right. You shouldn't do that. You love her. That's appealing to your higher nature. But if I say, Billy, if you stop shooting BBs at your sister, I'll give you a $50 allowance. What's that appealing to? Yeah. So you see, in some ways, what the framers did was design a system of government in which they used the energy of self-interest to check and limit self-interest. So let's see how this works in Federalist 10. So the faction is a problem in popular government. And again, the first part of the argument, Madison says, can you eliminate the causes? No, he says they're latent in human nature, they're hidden in human nature. Why is the problem of faction or factions rooted in human nature? Do people have different opinions?
Yes.
Do they have different, are some people smarter than others?
Yes.
Do they just like different things?
Mm-hmm.
So what would you have, literally, Madison says you'd have to do one of two things. You'd have to give everyone in society the same passion of interest, or take away liberty, which is the same thing. Does that make sense? and I mentioned in the lecture, did you see or read the book A Wrinkle in Time?
Yes.
That science fiction book by Madeline What's-Her-Face? They go to a planet called Calazans, where everybody is forced to do all the same things, wear the same clothes.
Oh yeah, it's creepy.
Isn't it? Well, by the way, as I said in my lecture, I think that's essentially what Marxism tries to do. It literally tries to create a faction without, a society without faction. Did it work? I don't think so. So on one level, if you can't eliminate faction, the only thing you can do is, Madison says, is to control its effects. And so in society, that means the system of government that you design. So if you can't remove the causes, you can control the effects. Now, if a faction consists of a minority of people in society, what's the solution to that in terms of controlling the effects of the power of minority? Madison asks, if a faction consists of a minority, because remember it could be either a majority or a minority of people. If it's a minority of the people, here, I'm a Jew, right? What if I suddenly passed the law, if I was the absolute dictator of America, that said, you have to stop celebrating Christmas and start celebrating Hanukkah, and you have to give me Hanukkah? Would you like that?
No.
So why don't Americans celebrate Hanukkah? Because Jews are a tiny majority in this country. Does that make sense? So that was just the example I wanted to use. So if you have a potentially fascist minority, how can you design society so that to address the power of a minority? By instituting majority rule. And that's what popular government is. Democracy, popular government, whatever, is ruled by the majority. Doesn't that make sense? So if you have a system that really works by majority rule, that's how you control the effects of a bad minority. But what happens if a faction is a majority of the people? How do you control the effects of a tyrannical majority? It's pretty hard, isn't it? Again, the problem was, in a small society like Athens, once a majority formed, then it controlled everything. Does that make sense? So now we go back to the species, the genus and species. So it turns out popular government, or rule by majority, can have two species, democracy and republic. What's the definition of a democracy here? Remember what letter does it begin with? Right. In other words, in a democracy, the people rule directly. And that means everything, they do everything in government. So if a tyrannical majority forms in a democracy, what chance does the minority have?
None.
Well, except appealing to the pity or the compassion of the majority. But if it's an extreme majority, then probably the minority is up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. Now, what defines a republic?
A republic is like a representative, kind of like what we have here, like a republic.
And Madison said, with respect to the power of a tyrannical majority, a republic is generally better than a democracy. Why?
Because it is easier, in a sense, to not have a tyrannical rule when you have a republic instead of a democracy.
Well, in a representative form of government, who actually makes the policy? The representatives do. So Madison says, it turns out in a republic, representation has a kind of filtering or refining effect, because public opinion, before it can affect the government, you have to go through the medium of election, right? And so it turns out that just having an election refines the power and the interest of a majority faction. Now, this is where Madison then, the original part of Federalist Ten, because, remember, prior to the Constitution, all republics were small in human history. So, by the way, even if a republic was better than a democracy, ultimately in a small republic, once a majority takes over society, eventually you won't be able to restrain it. But here's the thrust of Madison's arguments. The Constitution creates, for the first time in history, a huge republic Now think about this. In a huge, diverse society, a huge territory, a huge population, what happens to the number of factions in that society?
It increases.
Yes, and there's the good thing, because it turns out if you have lots of factions, then no one faction can become a majority and tear up society. Here's the example. In Iraq, by the way, or in Iran, I should say, in Iran, there are essentially 5 religious groups. You know what they are? What religious tradition is Iran?
Oh, Islam.
It's Islam. But it turns out, just like in Christianity, you have Protestants and Catholics. In Islam, you have 2 great factional divisions, which, by the way, they actually tend to be destructive to each other. Just like, but you know, the Catholics and Protestants try to kill each other during the first 100 years of the Reformation. What are the 2 factions in Islam? You've never heard this? Shia and Sunni.
Oh, I totally knew that. I don't know why.
The majority of Muslims are Sunni Islam, and 2 countries, Iran and Syria, are majority Shia, but Shia tends to be the majority. So it turns out there are a couple of other religious groups. There are a small number of Christians, small number of Jews, small number of Zoroastrians. You know what those were?
No.
The original Persian religion.
Ah.
And a group that you may or may never have heard of before. There's a small number of Baha'is. You ever heard of the Baha'i Church? It was formed in 1844 by a Muslim player in Iran. And the problem is, according to Islam, there can't be another prophet after Muhammad.
Yeah.
So any division that claims to have a new prophet becomes a heretical group. Those people are terribly persecuted in Iran. Now, how many religious groups do we have in America?
Too many.
A bunch.
There's actually a group in Washington, an organization that tracks them. It's estimated there are about 4,000 different religious denominations.
That's too many.
No. You have to see Madison's argument. Why is that better from the standpoint?
It's better because no one can take over control of the religious, like.
Does that make sense? That's the argument. So if you want to solve the faction in
You
society,
just have multiple.
you have to increase the number of factions so that it has a moderating influence on each other. And that you can only do in the large republic of the Constitution.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
So you're talking about how like you need to have a large number. So do you think that the 2-party system that we use right now is bad or good, or do you think it's just unavoidable regardless?
That's a good question, Cindy, because more or less throughout most of our history, the 2 parties have had a tendency to moderate each other because they had a tendency to draw from the moderate middle of the American populace. So in other words, Republicans and Democrats really weren't opposed on most issues. In other words, if you think, like, really from the end of World War I until recently, both Republicans and Democrats agreed on some kind of welfare state, they agreed on some kind of health care, they agreed on some kind of civil rights. But in the last 10 years, it seems as if the energy, and I'm still trying to understand why this has come about. So you could argue on the basis of this that perhaps a multi-party system would be better.
Right, but I don't know, like, do you think it's possible? Because it's like technically on the books we're a multi-party system because we have like independent runners and like, what was the last one we just had?
Well, by the way,
Green Party?
most, as you're going to discover, most governmental systems that have multi-party systems tend to be parliamentary systems.
Yeah.
What that means is they don't have separation of powers and checks and balances, like England or Israel or Italy. They have a legislature, and what people vote for in those countries are parties, and then the parties form coalitions, and that's how a parliamentary system works. So, as you're going to see, every system has its flaws and its good effects. And the problem with and Israel has just discovered this in the last 5 years. They've had 2 years actually. They've had 5 elections in 2 years, because what happens in the parliament is the coalitions formed by the 33 parties in the Israeli system are so fragile that if there's an issue where the coalition loses its power, then you have to call for new elections. And there comes a point where government needs a certain kind of stability too. So I'm still an advocate of the 2-party system, but it does seem to have descended into factional energy in a way that I don't think But I shouldn't say that. Weren't the Republicans and the Democrats in the Civil War pretty much on opposite sides of the question?
Oh, yeah.
One thought that slavery was permissible, and the other one said it was not. So again, whether or not a two-party system in general is better for a country, I think depends on the kinds of factional issues in that society. In a society like Iran, where 80% of the people are Shia, and about 15% are Sunni, and then these other fractional groups, the problem with a two-party system is it might give too much power to one majority faction.
Mm-hmm.
But in our country, well, think of the diversity of economic interest in America.
Yeah.
Of opinion groups, of religious groups. So I think Madison's argument that if you create a huge country that allows more factions to form, actually it will be better because the number of factions is what actually moderates.
Yeah.
I think actually that's played out in our society.
Yeah.
But it had never been done before.
Yeah.
So, and
Thank you.
He was so short. He was 5'4". Bless his heart.